you all. By the way, the quote that's on the screen comes from a very articulate document from the ELCA about the climate crisis that's pretty recent. And it lays out the scriptural, scientific, moral case for acting quickly towards solving the global climate crisis. So I just pulled that one particular quote because I thought that was kind of important. It's basically saying that we can't just sit around and wait. We have to do something. So I encourage you to take a look at that. It's pretty easy to find. But I have a handout that I can provide you if you give me your email address that we'll point to as well. So hopefully you took away from our last discussion that the very short summary that a evangelical Christian scientist makes of the climate crisis is it's bad, it's us, and it's real, and we can fix it. So you probably gathered those basic takeaways from the last discussion. So today we're going to talk about what we can do. And I have a series of topics that we'll talk about together. And then at the end, if you can fill out this little handout and just check some boxes on it, that will tell me what kinds of things people are interested in learning more about, and what kinds of things they've already done, and what kinds of things they are really interested in doing more of to help mitigate the global climate crisis. With that in mind, why don't we just go ahead and get underway. We probably have a quorum. So I wanted to start by just sharing a couple of general concepts that are useful to understand. And I wanted to find out if these are things you already know about or things that you want to learn a little bit more about. One of the concepts you'll probably hear talked about is the distinction between scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Anybody want to tell me what scope 1 is? Okay, I guess this is not something that's common knowledge. So it's pretty straightforward. Scope 1 is the fossil fuels you burn. Your car, your boiler in your house. And depending on how you think about it, when you go on a plane, you're burning fossil fuels to take that trip. So that's your direct decision to burn those fossil fuels. So that's scope 1 emissions, and this concept applies to individuals, households, companies, countries, even. Scope 2 is the emissions associated with electricity you purchase, or maybe there's another form of energy you buy that was generated in a way that produces emissions. So, you'll hear this concept talked about probably when people make arguments that, electric vehicles aren't that good because, some of our electricity is still being generated with coal and things like that, which is true, but it's changing rapidly. So the electricity sector in this country is probably the brightest spot in what otherwise is a pretty bleak picture of our emissions profile. And then scope 3 is essentially everything else. It's all the emissions that are associated with everything you buy. And that includes goods, of course, but also services. And it's very hard to think about scope 3 emissions. For companies, it's really important because it's almost always by far their biggest source of emissions. And there are some companies that are working really hard to try to change this, including companies like Walmart that are starting to set requirements for suppliers of theirs and require them to measure their emissions, do what they can to get the emissions down, and they have them on a program to reduce their emissions over time. So there definitely are companies that are working on that, but by and large, that's something that most everybody's trying to just duck out from under. So especially when you think about a company like Exxon, their scope 3 is all that oil and gas that they produce that we burn. So it's a really big topic and kind of a hot topic. So the other thing to really keep in mind is replacement cycles. It is critical that we don't make the mistake that our household has made recently, where we reinvest in something that is going to be producing emissions for a long time. This is probably the worst example of it is what's happening with many utilities who are quite comfortable with building gas plants. So their response to the demands of society to reduce emissions is, in many cases, to include building more gas plants. In our own case, we have had this, 20 years ago, we put in a gas boiler and we have in-floor radiant heating. It is a difficult system to convert from. We don't have vents in our house that could easily distribute the right amount of heat to all the rooms. So in our case, recently a pump went out. We fixed it. Well, it was like $1,000. Another pump went out. And another pump went out. And just recently, yet another pump went out. So because every time it happened, it was an emergency, right? We had to get it fixed because we had no heat. And now I'm going, I wish I had known all those pumps were going to fail. Because if I'd taken all that money and applied it, I would have had to still invest a lot, but I probably could have finally gotten rid of our gas. So you need to think ahead, particularly on those kinds of things, because it's likely that at some point I'm assuming many people in this room have gas boilers that are producing the heat in their homes. It's common in the Pacific Northwest. At some point that thing's going to break down. And if it does, and you want a quick fix, you're going to find yourself probably buying another furnace if you haven't planned for that. So, and that really that applies in particular to businesses. They need to be thinking ahead about when things are going to wear out and making sure they don't reinvest in things that are going to produce a lot of emissions over time, because you get stuck with them. Next one is, you may have probably heard this kind of slogan of electrify everything. It works pretty well for households. If you just look around at places that you're using energy that's not electricity and think about switching to electricity, that in general is going to be the thing you need to do to reduce your emissions footprint as a household. Another important concept to keep in mind is your diet. And there are definitely health benefits associated with plant-based diet. It's also a much lower emissions intensive diet. And I'll share some information about that in a second. Another concept is to think about every dollar you spend as a vote, in effect. If you're spending on a good or service, you have opportunities to spend that money with companies that are really making an effort to reduce their emissions. This is not an easy thing to figure out. There are sources like the Science Based Targets Initiative that have more European firms, unfortunately, than American firms. But there are companies who've been very public about their commitments. Microsoft's extremely public about their commitment, and they're very transparent about the challenges they have trying to get their emissions down. But one of the things you can often do is just look for any company's sustainability report. It's pretty much, for any large company, this has become pretty common. It's almost sort of a requirement. Now, trying to figure out how good a job they're doing when you look at that sustainability report is still kind of difficult. But at least it'll give you some sense for the commitments they are making. The last concept is simply that you've got to be heard. I think people assume that other people don't feel as strongly about this issue as they do, but in fact, the vast majority of Americans are either alarmed or concerned about the climate crisis. And yet we're all walking around thinking, I don't think I want to talk about this because somebody else might not think it's a big deal, and it make me uncomfortable to have that conversation, and I don't want to stir the pot or cause a conflict. Generally speaking, other people are worried too. So it's important for us, in particular in our democracy these days, we have to be more engaged. We have to demand change. So those are a few concepts to keep in mind as you're making daily decisions about life. They have an impact on your footprint. Okay, this is a little dense, probably hard to read.
Question.
Yeah, questions, please.
On your electrifying everything.
Yeah.
The electricity you get is going to be coming from petroleum plants or coal. What is the comparison in the efficiency that you get by buying electricity, knowing that that's a step away from, petroleum produced or coal produced versus you doing it yourself?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, we do have an option to get solar panels and substitute electricity generation that is entirely renewable for some amount of electricity that is made from coal or gas. In this region, in the Pacific Northwest, it's a pretty mild climate, and our electricity generation is cleaner than most anywhere in the United States because of hydroelectric power. So in this area, I wouldn't recommend investing in solar on the rooftop, given the other options you have that are going to have a bigger impact. And the third thing that's really important is that we have a law in this state that was passed in 2019 that requires the electricity system to become clean over time, and it's marching towards that. So your incremental impact of adding clean electricity to your rooftop isn't going to be as much as it might be in other places in the country. So did that answer your question?
Not really.
Okay, let's try again then.
Well, you talked about solar panels, but I wasn't addressing that issue. I understand that's a real direct benefit. But if you're using electricity in most parts of the country, it's coming from gas-fired or coal or hydro in some cases. Up here, I recognize it's much higher. So what's the ratio of benefit between your direct consumption versus getting it through electricity where they are using it? How much more efficient are they?
Oh, you mean is a central large plant more efficient than a distributed?
Yes.
In the past, it used to be very true that a big centralized plant was more efficient. In the future, that will no longer be true. Solar panels a solar farm is just a collection of solar panels, right? It's the same solar panel, just many of them. So the efficiency associated with a rooftop solar versus utility solar, it's a lot closer than you couldn't practically in the past have built a big gas plant, in your lot. But in the future, you can have solar panels, and the difference in the efficiency it's pretty much the same panel. I'm not sure I'm getting at what you're
I
asking.
think his question may be, if you're using fossil fuels in your home, let's say to heat your water, does your hot water heater, is it burning the natural gas as efficiently as if, compared to a electric generation plant that's using natural gas? Is their equipment more efficient at converting all of the energy in the natural gas into electricity than you are?
Well, from an efficiency standpoint, we should all get heat pumps.
I understand that, but I think the fundamental question we're trying to get at, and I had the same question, is do the electric generating plants convert the natural gas to electricity more efficiently than we can heat our hot water with gas?
Yeah, that is the question. And my assumption is yes, but to what degree? Is it twice the efficient?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay,
You still not
I'm
getting
not
the question?
following the question.
I can clarify.
So,
If I use a kilowatt of electricity,
yeah.
Okay, let me back up. If the electricity is generated centrally, there's a certain transmission loss in that electricity.
That's right.
To get to me to
Yeah.
use for whatever.
That's correct.
If I burn the gas in my home for my furnace instead of an electric furnace, I don't think there really isn't a transmission loss in distributing the natural gas.
That's correct, but that's not, so you have to look at what's the decision you're trying to make. Choosing between X and Y. The question as it's posed is entirely specific to each case. It can't be made, there's no generalization.
Well, we're really asking a thermodynamics question.
Yeah,
a
which
physics
is
question,
specific.
and I think Aaron's got it. So.
Yeah, so let's say you need to heat 1 bathtub's worth of water. That's your goal, right?
Sure.
Okay, so we have multiple options to do that. You can heat that with natural gas out of your home with a standard hot water tank.
Yeah.
let's say. Or you can buy an electric hot water tank, or a you know.
Which I wouldn't do.
But, okay, maybe a bad example of that. But the core question is, you have 2 options in your home to achieve a particular thing, whether it's heating your home or heating, let's say it's a bathtub of water.
Yeah.
Your option is either heat it with a fossil fuel in your home, like natural gas.
Gas or a heat pump. Those are the 2 choices, really.
Right, but the heat pump takes electricity, right?
That's correct.
So the question then is it more energy efficient to heat it with natural gas in your home or a heat pump which uses electricity? And the assumption, which holds in other regions, not here so much, is the electricity for that heat pump.
Well, I'm glad you brought this up because heat pumps are far more efficient. And the reason more efficient is that there is heat all around us. Even on a cold day, there is a certain amount of heat unless you're at absolute zero, right? And what heat pumps do really efficiently is they move heat from one place to another. And they work in reverse too, so you get cooling with the same principle. They can move heat that's inside to the outside. And so when you look at, you'll find things like SEER ratings associated with heat pumps. And those are effectively ratios of energy in versus energy out. And relative to natural gas, heat pumps are far more efficient.
Can I add something, Jeff? I think, first, 2 points. First of all, the electrification issue is also for a future goal of someday we will be shutting down coal and natural gas, and then still the electrical infrastructure is in place. I think that's part of it, part of the benefit. But also looking at like maybe a more direct example is an electric car versus an internal combustion engine. There is very much, you know, the electricity versus the gas you're burning right there. And I remember when I was getting my car, I did some research and they thought about what I was getting on my car would be equivalent to 100 miles a gallon for gas. So
That's right, because electric vehicles are incredibly more efficient than gas vehicles for 2 reasons. One is heat loss. Gas vehicles generate tons of heat that's just vented into the atmosphere. And that's why you have a radiator, because you have extra systems to try and keep them from getting too hot. The other thing is brakes. Brake energy is entirely lost in a gas internal combustion engine vehicle. I think the ratio, I have to go back and look at this, but I think the amount of energy that gets converted into moving you forward in an internal combustion engine vehicle is about 30%, because you lose a lot of it to heat and you lose a lot of it to friction of braking. In an electric vehicle, I think it's more like 60%. Okay, so they're twice as efficient. Similar to heat pumps, the electric use of electricity is just far more efficient in general. There's certainly little cases where, you know, maybe I happen to be on a grid that's still almost all coal, but they just closed down the last coal plant in New England. We're close to eliminating the last coal plant in the Northwest. So that's the past. The future is a clean grid, and it's getting there. It could get there a lot more quickly than I think most people realize. So absolutely electrify everything works as a general principle.
A little differently. Let's look at the future. Everything is electric. All cars are electric. Everybody's using electric in their houses. That electricity is generated by some source. How much have we improved our overall environmental situation by going all electric versus where we are today?
Infinitely. The electricity that we use from the sun is free.
Okay.
So,
all right, but you're assuming that we're going to be able to use solar panels and air turbines and so forth rather than generating it from plants.
there is no reason to continue. You weren't here for the last session, were you? Okay, so what you didn't see is that electricity generated through solar or wind is cheaper almost everywhere in the world than electricity generated by coal or gas. It's already cheaper. So if you choose to use another fuel, you're just choosing to pay more. So I can't think of any reason why we would do it unless it's not available to you in that particular
The
area.
big picture, it is feasible that all of our electrical needs can be met with the, solar panels and wind turbines.
Absolutely. And the places where it's, well, okay, let me talk about there are some needs for liquid fuels, which we also talked about last week, where you have very intensive uses like planes, big, heavy equipment. In those cases, we have alternative fuels that we can now generate that don't have the same emissions intensity as gas and oil. So we have options in all cases, and the options are improving all the time. So you'll hear the airlines talking about buying more sustainable aviation fuel, as an example, and the sustainable aviation fuel works the same as today's petroleum-based aviation fuel. It just doesn't have the same emissions footprint because it wasn't generated in the same way.
How much will we need to increase the electrical output on a gross national basis to meet the needs of all the cars being electric?
Now, 2 times.
Twice as much as we have
Yeah.
today. Okay.
Yeah, probably about. Our grid needs to effectively double. And also last week we talked about the fact that right now there are projects queued up waiting for utilities to put them on the grid that are solar or wind that represent twice the capacity of our current grid. So we have private developers have said, please, I want to do this project, please connect me to the grid, and the utilities are now the bottleneck. So the only reason we don't have 100% clean electricity today is because utilities are slow in responding to the demand.
So along that rate, you talked a little bit earlier about, generally speaking, in terms of the cleanliness or whatever, it's, at this point, it's about as good or just as good to let the utility convert from, a fossil fuel to solar. But with this, the energy grid capacity that needs to increase, is there a substantial benefit to putting solar on houses at endpoints where it's going to be consumed, both from a power loss over the grid efficiency standpoint? I mean, there's obviously one there, but as well as just if the utility does this, they don't have to actually implement the work aside from setting that meter on your house, and then the power's, to a degree, it's not, obviously on a day like today,
It's completely dependent. It's completely dependent on in the specific situation. Again, I can't generalize.
Yeah. In terms of a load capacity.
The potential in the future to be self-sufficient as a home exists, and in that case, you wouldn't need to be dependent on a utility for any of your energy needs. And along with that comes the possibility of not spending so much money on transmission and distribution infrastructure as we do today. So it's absolutely an opportunity. How to implement it and where it makes most sense to implement it, it's very specific.
I guess the question is, does that help solve our capacity issue?
It's part of the solution. It absolutely is.
Jeff, let's remind people that if you missed last week's session, it was recorded, it's on the...
Yeah, thank you. I do want to move forward because today we wanted to get to just exactly what do we do next. And this list is kind of my cheat sheet, if you will, of what a household in the Pacific Northwest should be thinking about to have the most impact on reducing their emissions footprint. And the first one is simply take fewer plane flights. That absolutely would have a significant impact. I looked at this once, and to take a family of 4 to Hawaii on a vacation has the same amount of emissions as driving your car for a year. So, I mean, this is the trade-off. It takes a lot of energy to lift a whole bunch of people in the air and send them thousands of miles. And it's all today based on fossil fuel burning. The second one is switching from that internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle. For one of the reasons we talked about is simply that it's twice as efficient as turning energy into movement. And the other fact is they're just cheaper to operate. Ours requires almost no maintenance. I get the tires rotated once a year. Some of the engines in these things, we really don't know. They could last 1 million miles in some cases. They last a lot longer, fewer moving parts, fewer things to wear out, a lot less complicated. The batteries do wear out, absolutely. The batteries are lasting longer, and we're getting better at swapping them out. So there's a lot of room for improvement there to make these vehicles go even longer, but they are clean, quick, quiet, and cheap to operate. Then you turn to your house. And the first thing I would recommend doing, because it'll help you make all the other decisions, is to get a energy efficient home energy audit. And the thing to know about these audits is that there's an audit that the utility pays someone to come do for you, which is just a pencil checklist audit. The one I recommend is the one that uses a blower test. So they actually kind of seal off your door, and they create a vacuum in your house, and that allows them to go around with a thermal camera and see where there's heat loss because heat is coming in, or air is moving between the inside and outside. And it'll surprise you sometimes where the leaks are. Now, if you do decide then that it makes sense to invest in sealing up your house, and probably any house that was built in the 70s and 80s still has a lot of room for improvement, especially in the insulation. But they may have leaky windows and leaky doors and gaps in various places where there's air coming in from the outside. If you go and tighten those up, you're probably going to want to introduce air exchange, which is a good thing anyways, because this is just going to give you clean, fresh air being brought into the house. And you can do it in a way where they take if you're warming it up in the winter, they'll take that, there's a heat exchanger, they take that energy back out before they vent it. We put one of those in when we built our house. These days, Puget Sound Energy has very generous rebates on things related to home energy efficiency. And I haven't tried to buy them through PSE, but they claim that they will subsidize 50 to 90% of the cost of some of these improvements. And that's largely because the states require the utilities to do a certain amount of this. They don't want to do it because they sell less energy, but they're required to do it. There's also then federal tax credits. And there is various limits on these depending on what year, what other projects you've done, but you could get $1,200 tax credit on improving the energy efficiency of your house. And then going back to my previous point, probably doesn't make sense usually to change out windows and to put solar panels on in the Pacific Northwest with a mild climate and a generally clean grid already. It's just not, you're just not going to get the same impact relative to the amount of cost involved in those things. The lowest hanging fruit change to make in your household is replace your gas water heater with a heat pump, hot water heater. And these days, that's, depending on the unit, going to be between $1,500 to $3,000 installed. And there are $500 rebates from PSE and up to 30% tax credit on that. So there's some pretty big incentives, and more coming with the IRA, but they're kind of slow to arrive, so I can't really tell you whether the state has yet implemented those programs. So that's a relatively modest investment. The next investment, which is quite significant, is to replace your gas heating, your furnace, with a heat pump. And you're going to get cooling as well, which if you're ever thinking about selling your house, unfortunately that's become a requirement now after having 109-degree heat dome events, which there will be more of. People are going to want to know that you have air conditioning. So you get that at the same time. There are rebates up to $3,000 through Puget Sound Energy and $2,000 through the federal tax code. So there are some pretty big incentives to do that now. We did it recently. Again, our infrastructure is hard to replace with a heat pump, but we have these smaller vents that we use for the air exchange, and we put a heat pump in primarily to give us cooling. And then when we did it, I realized that heat pump can do most of the work of heating the house in the spring and the fall. So I'm really bound to using the gas furnace for heating only on the cold winter days. And then the last step, if you do all of these things and implement this last step, you will probably have a emissions-free household, if you include the EV purchase. An induction stove these days will cost you between $1,500 and $2,500. And there are rebates under the IRA, but it's not clear to me that they're implemented yet. So it's going to be specific to where you're doing it and what your utility has done in that area. PSE doesn't have any rebates for induction stove purchases. A friend of mine has done all these things. He did this recently and he turned off his gas service. And that has a pretty significant financial benefit because there are a surprising amount of fixed costs in your bill every month, and those just then go away. The amount of gas that you need to do cooking is really small. So by the time you get this furnace replaced, then it's a small step to replace the gas that you're using for cooking.
Jeff, can I just throw in one
Yep,
little thing
please.
on the induction stove? There's another problem with gas stoves that people are just discovering is that they do slow, even when they're turned off, they slowly will emit
They leak.
gas.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of, there's people I've read about that they just first thing they get into those.
Yeah.
Indoor health.
There's been a fair amount of study of that in buildings in New York City, for example, where they've got gas in apartments that are small, and the health consequences of the amount of leakage from the gas is pretty significant. They're worried about asthma with children in particular is one of the big problems.
I'd like to remind everyone that here at St. Andrews, the stove in the kitchen is a gas-burning relic that has needed replacement for years. The refrigerator is very old and needs replacement. Years ago, the youth covered it with some sort of styrofoam to minimize the noise. And the fan in the kitchen is noise pollution. So there's something we could do right here.
Yes, you do have opportunities here.
Yeah.
Please.
So, and the other, I was, as a physician, I can tell you that, there's a lot of concern about gas stoves, just the combustion itself in our house. That this is another contributor. Asthma's on the rise in the United States for a lot of reasons, but it's burnt hydrocarbons.
Yeah.
As number one. And then I guess number two, to the comment about efficiency, what can the church do specifically? That's something that council's working on with our building committee and finance committee. We only have so much money. What is going to happen after fixing these soffits over here and the plug gutters is the next thing is to replace the hot water tank which is just, women won't know, but as you enter the men's bathroom, the sexton's closet is to the right. There's a 75-gallon hot water just sitting there, all the time, getting heated, right? And we don't use much hot water. We don't take showers. We don't take baths. The only thing we use it for is the kitchen and the scullery. So there's going to be a lot of discussion about that and replumbing.
Well, sometimes you can also put in flash heaters.
Well, that's we have one here in the scullery that helps heat for the dishwasher, but we also want to put a bigger one in there. So
But we also have to replace the piping.
Yeah, that way the piping too.
So that's the big expense.
Yeah, lots to do.
Having an on-demand heater will, greatly reduce our carbon footprint and hopefully save money in the long run, although we're still using natural gas.
Thanks for bringing that up. Dick?
Does a heat pump that you're using for heating the house have any common can it use the heat exchanger? Can you use the same heat exchanger for the hot water as you do for the furnace? Or are they totally separate systems?
Well, the heat exchanger I was talking about heating the air.
Right. I'm just saying, if you do both the furnace and the hot water, are there any common elements that save you money?
Unfortunately, it's going to be completely specific to your house, so I can't really generalize on that one. I mean, but that's why you want to get the home energy audit done, because you're going to learn about, they're going to look around at your specific situation and give you recommendations. That's why I recommend it. And that costs, net is going to cost you about $300. And there might be opportunities if there's a large group of people that are close together, like on the east side here, we might be able to get a company to give a discount because they could efficiently go around and get a couple of these done a day. So, so this is sort of my checklist and of things that you can do, and we've been working our way through these ourselves at our house, and we've been able to cut our emissions about 60% to date. It didn't hurt when the daughters left. There was a lot less hot water use. I want to talk about food for a minute, because this is something it took me for a while to learn about. This is probably a little bit hard to see, so let me just explain what this is. This analysis on the left is the chart that estimates the emissions intensity per person of a 2,600 calorie diet that has different compositions to it, right? Different choices about, especially protein. So the one on the left is a meat lover. They eat a lot of beef and pork, in particular, maybe lamb. Lamb is the other big one. The next one is an average diet. The third one is a no beef diet. And the fourth and the fifth ones are vegetarian and vegan. And you can see the impact when you go from this first diet to this third one of lots of meat and no beef. That you're reducing the emissions intensity of your diet quite a bit. And that's simply because of the emissions intensity of beef and lamb in particular. And it's both because they're ruminants, and they burp up methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, has a lot higher impact than carbon dioxide in the near term. But also just because of the calorie in, calorie out efficiency of eating beef versus eating grains or vegetables. It's very different. And that's what this table on the right is trying to show. So the amount of energy we get out of eating corn is about the same as the amount of energy it takes to produce it. And the reason for that is simply that we're harvesting some of the energy that the corn plant is pulling from the solar radiation. Right? So that energy is embodied in the kernels of corn, and that's why that's slightly greater than 100%. We get a little more out than goes into making it. Milk is surprisingly energy efficient per calorie because it's pretty dense, calorie dense. Eggs, chicken, apples, they're all lower. I was thinking about apples the other day, and I'm betting that has to do with the fact that it takes quite a bit of time and effort to pick them and get them to where you need them, but they also have to be cold processed, right? So there's a lot of energy that goes into keeping fruit and dairy cold throughout the supply chain into your, into the supermarket and into your refrigerator. Beef is at the bottom of this list. It takes about 25 calories in of energy to produce 1 calorie when we consume beef of energy for our bodies. So it's a much less efficient form of eating. So those are a couple of principles to think about when you're planning your diet. I've been pleasantly surprised. My wife's taken on the challenge of doing this in our household, and yet we still enjoy Wagyu beef. Very good. I really love that stuff. But we have switched to, I think we probably have beef or pork once a week now. And she's just sort of gradually, New York Times has been her go-to source for recipes, and she started just bringing in more vegetarian recipes, and a lot of them are just really tasty. So I really can't say that I've suffered from this switch over time. It's a pretty easy one to make.
Well, and as a physician, I would just add the huge health benefits of simply eliminating red meats.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
especially processed meats, so things like bologna, hot dogs, very, very bad for cardiovascular health and cancer risk. So
Yeah.
if you don't want to do it for the energy benefits for society, do it for your own health.
So I know it's really early, and I know from a physician's standpoint, we don't have a lot of answers here. Do we have any sense of what the efficiency is for synthetically generated red meat?
I haven't studied that.
Okay.
I'm not going to take a stab at that one.
Very, very cutting edge. I was just curious.
Yeah. I think it's easier to just sort of slipstream vegetarian recipes into your diet, and after a while, you won't really notice that you made the change. So that's something to think about.
Chickens fall on that scale, efficiency scale. Chickens, red meat, chicken, I don't.
Chicken's right here at 15%.
Okay.
So
What about fish?
I can't remember. I didn't see that one on the chart, and I was looking for it, so I don't really know. It's probably pretty efficient. I'm sorry, over here.
Packaging, food packaging drives me nuts.
I know. I can't. That's kind of a separate topic, and I can't help you with that one. I have seen more of the chicken coming with PET. That's number 1 on your chart, which this is a whole different topic, but that one is definitely going in the recycle bin. So they're getting better. And I think we're getting rid of some foam packaging in. Yeah.
Nice. Gotcha.
Okay, so sort of related to that, then when you're actually buying food, in addition to this reduction in beef, lamb, and to a lesser degree pork, the 2 other things you can look at are buying in season wherever possible and buying local wherever possible. And it's pretty tempting. I love pears, and the other day I was given the assignment of picking up some pears, and I thought maybe it was just an extension of the pears that I had been buying that were local a couple months ago. And I got them home, and I pulled the sticker off, and I realized they came from Argentina. And they got rotten really fast. So there's multiple reasons why. I mean, it's convenient. You can get great stuff in the winter, but it's coming from South America. It's getting air shipped to get to us, and it doesn't have the same shelf life. So there are various reasons why, I'm going to try and be more rigorous about watching out for those labels. Right now, you can get blueberries that are coming from California, not from Argentina, but that season's pretty short, so you just have to start really paying attention to seasons and just buying what's in season. Okay, when it comes to goods and services, this is really hard and complicated, I'll just admit. One of the things you can do is start signing up for these buy nothing groups and try to use that principle in your own consumption. Do you really need to buy a new thing? Could you get a used one? Could you rent? And then the general principle that you'll hear talked about is reduce, reuse, recycle. So of course the least impactful purchase is the one you don't make. The next least impactful is the one where at its end of life it can be refurbished and most of the materials can be turned into a new product. And then the one that does require have more impact is when it actually goes through the whole recycling chain and gets, melted down or whatever it is they do with it. That takes quite a bit of energy. If you ever want to do this, it's quite fun. If you go to the Recology plant in Seattle and take their little tour, you'll be amazed at what you'll learn about the amount of effort that goes into trying to recycle all the stuff that we just conveniently just throw into the bin and say, I'm hoping that gets recycled. It's pretty eye-opening. And then the last one that I talked about earlier was rewarding companies who are really making an effort to reduce their emissions. And again, there's no simple way to do this, but you can look for sustainability reports and lists from various organizations. I mentioned SBTI, another one is Ceres. These are organizations that can tell you about companies that are really trying to make a difference. All right. This is the last topic that I wanted to touch on, and then I did want to learn what you are interested in learning more about. So just a brief ad about that, and then we'll wrap this up. at your table, you should have a pencil and a sheet which you can check boxes on. If you could do that, that will give me some more information about topics that people might be interested in learning more about. And it would also, at the bottom, if you want to give me your email address, I can send you a 4-page handout I've written which covers a lot of these topics. So, I was reminded the other day when I looked at Yale Climate Communications survey information. They're the one organization that does the most rigorous job of collecting information about public opinion related to climate change. And I was reminded and just staggered by the statistics. If you ask people this statement, most scientists agree that global warming is happening. 56% of Americans say yes to that, which is stunning because for 20, 30 years, 99% of qualified scientists, not the ones who are being paid by the oil companies, but the real scientists who are part of the IPCC, which includes tens of thousands of climate research around the world, they've been unanimous about the fact that global warming is happening and it's caused by humans. So there has been no there's been a strong scientific consensus for a long, long time. It's really staggering how long it's taking for Americans to understand that. And that is in part because of what I mentioned at the outset here about the fact that while many of us are really worried about global warming, we're uncomfortable talking about it, or we're just out looking for chances to talk about solutions, which we have really good ones. And I think that's part of the reason that this is really lagging. So, I recall doing a little role play exercise, if anyone was here for that, 4 years ago, where we modeled a climate conversation. That was with this sort of grumpy uncle, at Thanksgiving sort of scenario. Well, there aren't many people who really think like that anymore. So by far the biggest problem is that there are many of us who are very worried who aren't taking concrete actions to do anything about it. So that's really where, if you are committed now to having an impact, I encourage you to do it with other people. It's good for your morale and it's actually more effective. So there are all sorts of organizations. I can just highlight a few because I've been involved with some of them. Citizens Climate Lobby is one that's nonpartisan, and they've been really helpful for me in understanding how our democracy works and giving me chances to actually go and engage with elected officials in a way that's really productive. So I've been doing that for 5 years now, and you can also decide to do things yourself. You talked about the work that the council's doing on making some investments around the church that will have a reduction in emissions footprint. But you can also start a CreationCare team and start looking for ways to make change happen in the St. Andrews community. The big leverage point is not just this building, it's all the buildings that everybody in the congregation lives in or works in. All of those buildings need to be retrofitted to reduce their carbon footprint. And the last thing I would encourage you to do is just don't accept the current situation. When you meet with your elected officials, tell them you want change. Meeting with them is pretty time intensive. There are really simple tools. Sorry I forgot the name of it, but it's in my handout. There's one tool that can kind of remind you every so often to call your elected officials' offices and tell them you want to see some certain thing happen. And they'll do this kind of coinciding with when legislation is in play or just when a topic is really in the national conversation. The Citizens Climate Lobby organization has a tool like that every now and then I'll get a text message saying time to call your elected officials. I click on the link, it's got the phone number, make a call. I frequently get through to a live person. If I don't, I leave a message. That's far more effective than sending emails or signing up for petitions, which are usually fundraising vehicles. So, At this point, I'm done with what I want to say. We have 10 minutes. We have time for general questions if you want to ask questions about anything that we've talked about today. Dick?
In terms of the legislature doing things, there was a bill in the Washington legislature this year to ban gas furnaces in new homes. Highly controversial, a lot of pushback. I'm not sure where that ended up, but I mean, this was a really big issue. Are you up in what happened?
I don't know where that landed. Nope. You could go look it up in code. So the other thing to remember is that some of these things happen at a city basis, a county basis, a state basis. I know that Seattle's already done that. No new gas in new construction of certain types, so probably smaller ones. It's a little. There are some situations when you have a big volume of space that you might want to heat quickly, where it might be harder to do that with a heat pump system than a gas system. But
some of the things that are happening in Bellevue specifically is that there are a number of people that were elected to city council this last election cycle. I won't name names, but I've been involved with some of these people. We've had Jared Newenice come to the church here, and they're very, very aware. This is the city of Bellevue has an agenda in terms of climate change, just lost my train of thought a little bit about that, but I'll come back to that. Yesterday we celebrated the opening of the 2-line here, Bellevue Red. A number of us ran into several people from church that were there at the opening, which is a great thing, getting people off the roads and into electrified trains. So that's kind of coming along. So a lot of people, I'm kind of interested in this stuff too, not as technology. There is a website, EIA.gov, which is the American, U.S. government energy information agency, and you can go there, and if people were kind of alluding to this earlier, 60% across the United States, take all 50 states, 60% of our electricity comes from coal or natural gas. It's about 20% coal, 40% natural gas, but renewables are more than 20%, nuclear is 18%. The numbers are, the change is moving, as Jeff was saying, last week especially. It's just getting these new projects online, more renewables online.
yeah, there is a big change happening around the globe. In the European Union in 2023, the organizations that are covered by their ETS, which is the equivalent of the cap and trade system, they dropped their emissions 15% in a year. And Europe as a whole reduced theirs, I think, 8% in 2023. Now, some of that came because of Putin. He pretty much shut down natural gas, and as part of the war in Ukraine, everybody realized we really got to get off gas. It's bad on a number of levels, including national security for them.
So yeah, we just got back from the UK a couple weeks ago, and so the US is 60% on fossil fuels. They're at 33%, and only 1% of electricity in the UK is generated from 1%, or 20%. So they're making huge strides. As North Sea wind farms that they have. They had a couple of days last summer where they were 0% fossil fuels.
Yeah. So if you can do me a favor and fill out your sheet and leave it on the table, I'll collect them, and I'll, if there's certain topics that obviously a lot of people are interested in, we can talk more about those, or if you want to get more information, I can send you something, and so just leave your email on that sheet.
How long does electricity remove it from Arizona?
We need a lot more transmission, high volume transmission facilities in our country. We don't have a lot of that right now. We need to have a mismatch between where the electricity can be generated and where it's needed. So it tends to be in areas in the middle of the country where there's, like in Texas, where there's tons of solar and wind, and the Midwest, there's tons of wind, but it's really needed more on the coasts. So yeah, it's hard to get the energy from where we have it, renewable energy from where we most have it to where we need it right now.
Jeff, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate